Jai. So reading from Srimad Bhagavatam, beginning of the 10th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Tivaranda Shagaranjana Shalakaya Chakshudam Viditam Yena Tasmai Shigurave Namaha. So, very auspicious as we're coming up on the holidays, that is the Vaishnava holidays like Janmashtami, Radhastami, Balarama's appearance day. We're beginning the 10th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam. So, what we're going to do to start the 10th canto of the Srimad Bhagavatam, of course, we'll read, first of all, the summary of the 10th canto, and which would probably take about 2 days to read. It's a long summary of the 10th canto. And then we'll start with the first chapter. So, summary of the 10th canto. And we're going to be reading, I guess you have it up there. A short description of each chapter in this 10th canto is as follows. The first chapter, which has 69 verses, describes Maharaj Parikshit's eagerness to learn about the incarnation of Lord Krishna, and it also tells how Kamsa killed the 6 sons of Devaki because of his fear of being killed by her 8th child. The second chapter contains 42 verses describing the entrance of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Krishna, into the womb of Devaki to fulfill his mission of killing Kamsa. When Lord Krishna was within Devaki's womb, all the demigods headed by Brahma offered prayers to the Lord. The third chapter contains 53 verses. This chapter describes the appearance of Lord Krishna as he is. The Lord's father and mother, understanding the Lord's appearance, offered prayers. Fearing Kamsa, the Lord's father, brought the child from Mathura to Gokula, Vrindavan. The fourth chapter contains 46 verses, which tells of a prophecy by the goddess Chandika. After consulting demoniac friends, Kamsa began killing all the children born at that time, since he thought this would be to his benefit. It's actually important to read this summary because it helps us have an overview of the whole 10th canto. That's why we're taking the time to read it. The fifth chapter contains 32 verses describing how Nanda Maharaj performed the birth ceremony of Krishna, and then went to Mathura, where he met Vasudeva. The sixth chapter contains 44 verses, and this chapter, Nanda Maharaj, following the advice of his friend Vasudeva, returns to Gokul, and on the way sees the dead body of the Putana demoness, and is astonished at her having been killed by Krishna. The seventh chapter, which contains 37 verses, describes Maharaj Parikshit's enthusiasm to hear about the boyhood pastimes of Lord Krishna, who killed Sakatasura and Trinavartasura, and showed within his mouth the entire cosmic manifestation. In the 8th chapter, there are 52 verses which describe Garga Munis performing the name-giving ceremony of Krishna and Balaram, and how Krishna and Balaram perform playful childish activities, crawling on the ground, trying to walk with their small legs, and stealing butter and breaking the pots. This chapter also describes the vision of the universal form. The 9th chapter, which has 23 verses, describes how Krishna disturbed his mother while she was churning butter. Because she left Krishna to see to the store where the milk was boiling and did not allow him to suck her breast, Krishna was very angry and broke a pot of yogurt. To chastise her naughty child, Mother Yashoda wanted to bind him with rope. But every time she tried, she failed because of a shortage of rope when the time came to knot it. In the 10th canto, there are 43 verses. In the 10th chapter, there are 43 verses. This chapter describes how Krishna, as Dharmaghosh, caused the twin Yamala Arjuna trees to fall, and how the 2 demigods within the trees were delivered by the mercy of Krishna. In the 11th chapter, there are 59 verses. This chapter describes how Nanda Maharaj released Krishna from the ropes, how Krishna showed his mercy to a fruit seller while exchanging grains for fruit, and how Nanda Maharaj and others decided to leave Gokula for Vrindavan when Krishna killed Vatsasura and Bakasura. So, just a little information here. So, Gokula is on the eastern side of the Yamuna River. So a little bit of geographic information. And Vrindavan referring to the forest, not only the city, there's a city of Vrindavan, which we know today, where the Goswamis of Vrindavan established the principal temples. But then Vrindavan forest is the largest forest within Braj area. And it actually extends all the way to Govardhan. Very, very large forest. And years ago, when Krishna was present, the Yamuna River went almost all the way to Govardhan too. So the geography was a little bit different than it is today. So, chapter 12 contains 44 verses describing Krishna's pastimes with the cowherd boys in the forest and the killing of the demon named Aghasura, snake demon. Chapter 13 contains 64 verses describing how Brahma stole Krishna's calves and his friends, the cowherd boys. Krishna expanded his pastimes for 1 year, representing himself as the calves and boys in forms exactly like their own. In this way, he bewildered Brahma, who at last surrendered when his illusion was over. The 14th chapter contains 61 verses. In this chapter, Brahma offers prayers to Krishna after fully understanding him to be the Supreme Personality of Godhead. The 15th chapter contains 52 verses. This chapter describes how Krishna entered the Talavana forest with Balaram, how Balaram killed Dhenukasura, and how Krishna protected the cowherd boys and cows from the poisonous effects of Kaliya. The 16th chapter contains 67 verses. This chapter describes the chastisement of Kaliya by Krishna and also describes the prayers offered by Kaliya's wives. In the 17th chapter, there are 25 verses. This chapter describes why Kaliya entered the river Yamuna after leaving his home, Nagalia, one of the Dweepas, which according to some corresponds to the Fiji Islands. Actually, Prabhupada said that when he visited Fiji. This chapter also describes how Garuda was cursed by Sobari Rishi, how the cowherd boys, Krishna's friends, were enlivened when Krishna emerged from the Yamuna, and how Krishna stopped the forest fire and saved the sleeping inhabitants of Braj. The 18th chapter contains 32 verses giving a description of Krishna and Balaram. Their picnics within the forest, the climate of Vrindavan in the summer and the spring, and Lord Balaram's killing of Palambasura. Chapter 19 contains 16 verses describing Krishna's entering the forest known as Munjaranya, saving the cowherd boys and cows from the forest fire, and bringing them to Mandiravana. Chapter 20 contains 49 verses. This chapter describes the enjoyment of Balaram and Krishna in the forest with the cowherd boys during the rainy season, and it gives various instructions through analogies concerning the rainy season and autumn. Chapter 20 contains 20 verses describing how Krishna entered the forest of Vrindavan in the autumn, playing his flute, and how he attracted the gopis who were singing his glories. The 22nd chapter contains 38 verses describing how the gopis prayed to the goddess Katyayani to obtain Krishna as their husband, and how Krishna later stole the garments of the gopis while the gopis were bathing in the Yamuna. The 23rd chapter contains 52 verses describing how the cowherd boys, being very hungry, followed Krishna's directions by begging some food for him and themselves from the brahmanas engaged in performing yagyas. The brahmanas refused to give food to Krishna and Balaram, although the boys begged for it, but the wives of the brahmanas agreed, and therefore Krishna bestowed his mercy upon them. The 24th chapter contains 38 verses describing how Krishna defied King Indra despite Indra's position of prestige by stopping the Indra Yagya and instead worshiping Govardhan. The 25th chapter contains 33 verses as described in this chapter. Because the Indra Yagya was stopped, King Indra was very angry, and to kill the inhabitants of Vrindavan Braj, he flooded the entire area with rain. Krishna, however, accepted King Indra's challenge by lifting Govardhan Hill as an umbrella to protect Vrindavana and all the cows. The 26th chapter, there's a little devotee there. Okay. The 26th chapter contains 25 verses describing how Nanda Maharaj, seeing the extraordinary activities of Krishna, was struck with wonder, and how he thus narrated for all the coward men the whole story of Krishna's opulence, as foretold by Garga Muni. Chapter 27, which contains 28 verses, describes how King Indra, upon seeing Krishna's unlimited power, worshipped Lord Krishna, who was fully washed with milk and supplied by the Surabhi, and who with milk supplied by the Surabhi, and who thus became known as Govinda. The 28th chapter contains 17 verses. In this chapter, Krishna saves his father Nanda Maharaj from the custody of Baruda and shows the coward men how Vaikuntha Loka is situated. So any questions so far? No questions. Okay. Everybody understands this. The 29th chapter contains 48 verses describing how Krishna talked to the gopis before performing the Rasa Leela, and how after the beginning of the Rasa Leela, Krishna disappeared from the scene. Chapter 30 contains 44 verses describing how the gopis, being separated from Krishna, went mad and began to wander in the forest in search of him. The gopis met Srimati Radharani, the daughter of King Vrishabhanu, and they all wandered on the bank of the Yamuna searching for Krishna. Chapter 31 contains 19 verses describing how the bereaved gopis waited in great anxiety to meet Krishna. Chapter 32 contains 22 verses. In this chapter, Krishna appeared among the gopis who were fully satisfied in ecstatic love for him. Chapter 33 contains 39 verses. In this chapter, Krishna appears in multi-forms in the midst of the gopis with whom he dances in the Rasa dance. Then they all bathe in the river Yamuna. Also in this chapter, Shukadeva mitigates the doubts of Parikshit concerning the performance of the Rasa Leela. Because Parikshit does state in this particular book, Jagupshitam, he says, this sort of activity in the material world is most degraded, most horrible. And Shukadeva Goswami explains how this is transcendental activity. Chapter 34 contains 32 verses. This chapter describes how Nanda Maharaj, Krishna's father, was swallowed by a big python who had been a demigod named Vidyadhara, but was cursed by Angira Rishi. Krishna rescued his father and saved this demigod simultaneously. Chapter 35 contains 26 verses. This chapter describes how Krishna went to the pasturing ground with the cows and how the gopis sang in separation from him. Chapter 36 contains 40 verses. This chapter describes Krishna's killing of Rishdasura. It also describes Narada's disclosure to Kamsa that both Rama and Krishna were sons of Vasudeva. Because of this disclosure, Kamsa arranged to kill both Rama and Krishna. He sent his assistant Keshi to Vrindavan, and later he sent Akrura to bring Rama and Krishna to Mathura. Chapter 37 contains 33 verses. In this chapter, Krishna kills the Keshi demon. Narada worships Krishna by narrating his future activities, and Krishna kills the demon named Vyomasura. That means a demon who flies in the air. Chapter 38 contains 43 verses. This chapter describes how Akrura went to Vrindavan and how he was received by Raman Krishna and Nanda Maharaj. Chapter 39 contains 57 verses. This chapter describes how Rama and Krishna, having been invited by Kamsa, started for Mathura. While they were ready on the chariot, the gopis began to cry, and Krishna sent his messenger to pacify them. Thus he was able to travel toward Mathura. On the way, Akrura was shown the entire Vaikuntha Loka within the water of the Yamuna. Chapter 40 contains 30 verses in which the prayers of Akrura are described. Chapter 41, which contains 52 verses, describes the entrance of Rama and Krishna to the city of Mathura, where the ladies were very jubilant to see these two brothers. Krishna killed a washerman glorified Sudama, and gave Sudama his benediction. Chapter 42, which contains 38 verses, describes how Krishna delivered Kubja and how he broke Kamsa's gigantic bow and killed its caretakers. Thus Kamsa and Krishna met. Chapter 43 contains 40 verses outside the sporting arena of Kamsa. Krishna killed an elephant named Kuvalyapita. Then he entered the arena and spoke with Chanura. It's one of the wrestlers. Chapter 44, which contains 51 verses, describes how Krishna and Balaram killed the wrestlers named Chanura and Mushtaka, Krishna and Balaram, and thereafter Kamsa and his 8 brothers. Krishna, however, pacified Kamsa's wives and his own father and mother, Vasudeva and Devaki. Chapter 45 contains 50 verses. This chapter describes how Krishna pacified his father and mother and celebrated the enthronement of his grandfather Ugrasena. After promising the inhabitants of Vrindavan that he would return very soon, Krishna underwent ritualistic ceremonies as a Kshatriya. He took the vow of brahmacharya and lived in the Gurukula, where he studied regularly. By killing the demon named Panchajanya, he received a conchal named Panchajanya. Krishna rescued the son of his guru from the custody of Yamaraj and returned them. After thus offering Guru Dakshin to repay his teacher, Lord Krishna returned to Mathura Puri. Chapter 46 contains 49 verses as described in this chapter. Krishna sent Uddhava to Vrindavan to pacify his father and mother, Nanda Maharaj and Yashoda. Chapter 47 contains 69 verses describing how Uddhava, following Krishna's order, went to pacify the gopis and then returned to Mathura. Thus, Uddhava appreciated the ecstatic love felt for Krishna by the inhabitants of Vrindavan. Wow, a lot of pages here. Chapter 48, anyway, gives us a good overview of the whole canto, which is very important because this is the smiling face of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, the culmination of all the other cantos of the Srimad Bhagavatam. Chapter 48 contains 36 verses. This chapter describes how Krishna fulfilled the desire of Kubja by going to her house and enjoying her. Krishna then went to the home of Akrura. Satisfied by Akrura's prayers, Krishna praised him very much, and sent him to Hastinapura to gather information about the Pandavas. Chapter 49 contains 31 verses as described in this chapter. Akrura, following Krishna's orders, went to Hastinapura where he met Vidura and Kunti and heard from them about Dhritarashtra's mistreatment of the Pandavas. Informed of the Pandavas' faith in Krishna, Akrura advised Dhritarashtra, and after understanding Dhritarashtra's mind, he returned to Mathura, where he described everything about the situation in Hastinapura. Chapter 50 contains 57 verses. In this chapter, Jarasandha, having heard that his son-in-law Kamsa was killed, attacked Mathura to kill Rama and Krishna, but was defeated 17 times. Very determined. When Jarasandha was about to attack for the 18th time, Kalayavana, having been advised by Narada, also attacked Mathura. Thus, the Yadava dynasty entered a fort in the midst of the water and lived there by mystic power. That's Dwarka. After giving protection to the Yadava dynasty and conferring with Lord Balaram, Lord Baladev, Lord Krishna emerged from Dwarka. Chapter 51, which contains 63 verses, describes how Muchukunda killed Kalayavana simply by glancing upon him. Chapter 52 contains 44 verses. In this chapter, Muchukunda offers prayers to Krishna, and then Krishna kills all the soldiers of Kalayavana and returns to Dwarka with their booty. When Jarasandha attacked Mathura again, Rama and Krishna, as if afraid of him, fled to the top of a mountain, to which Jarasandha then set fire. Unseen by Jarasandha, Krishna and Balaram jumped from the mountain and entered Dwarka, which was surrounded by the sea. Jarasandha, thinking that Krishna and Balaram had been killed, returned with the soldiers to his own country, and Krishna continued to live in Dwarka. Rukmini, the daughter of Vidara, was very much attracted to Krishna, and she sent Krishna a letter through a brahmana. Chapter 53 contains 57 verses following Rukmini's request. Krishna went to the city of Vidarbha and kidnapped her in the presence of such enemies as Jarasandha. Chapter 54 contains 60 verses. As described in this chapter, Krishna defeated all the opposing princes and disfigured Rukmini's brother Rukmi. Disfigured means he just cut his hair off in certain strange ways. Not that he disfigured, cut his face or anything. Then Krishna returned with Rukmini to Dwarka, where they were united in a regular marriage. Rukmi, however, remained in a place known as Bhojakata, being angry at his brother-in-law Krishna. Chapter 55, containing 40 verses, describes the birth of Pradyumna, how Pradyumna was kidnapped by Shambharasura, and how Pradyumna later killed Shambharasura and returned to Dwarka with his wife Rati Devi. Chapter 56 contains 45 verses. As described in this chapter, King Kshatrajit, by the mercy of the sun god, received a jewel called Shaimantaka. Later, when this jewel was stolen, Kshatrajit unnecessarily became doubtful of Krishna, but Krishna, to vindicate his position, retrieved the jewel along with the daughter of Jambavan. Krishna later married Kshatrajit's daughter and received a full dowry. As described in chapter 57, which contains 42 verses, both Balaram and Krishna went to Hastinapura, having heard about the fire in the Shalak house of the Pandavas. After Satyajit was killed by Shatadhanva at the instigation of Akrura and Kritavarma, Balaram and Krishna returned to Dwarka. Shatadhanva left the Shaimantaka jewel with Akrura and fled to the forest. Thus, although Krishna killed Shatadhanva, he was unable to retrieve the jewel. Finally, the jewel was discovered and awarded to Akrura. Chapter 58 contains 58 verses. After the Pandavas finished living incognito in the forest, Krishna went to Indraprastha to see them. He then married 5 wives headed by Kalindi. After Krishna and Arjuna had set fire to the Kandava forest, Arjuna received the Gandiva bow. The demon Mayadanava constructed an assembly house for the Pandavas, and Duryodhana was very much aggrieved. Chapter 59 contains 45 verses. In this chapter, Krishna, at the request of Indra, kills the demon Narakasura, the son of the earth personified, along with the demon's associates headed by Mura. The earth personified offers prayers to Krishna and returns to him all the paraphernalia that Narakasura had stolen. Krishna then bestows fearlessness upon the son of Narakasura and marries the 16,000 princesses whom the demon kidnapped. Also in this chapter, Krishna takes away the Parijata plant from the heavenly planets, and the foolishness of Indra and others is described. Chapter 60 contains 59 verses. In this chapter, Krishna makes Rukmini angry with his joking words. Krishna pacifies Rukmini, and there is a lover's quarrel between them. Chapter 61 contains 40 verses. This chapter contains a description of the sons and grandsons of Krishna. At the time of Aniruddha's marriage, Balaram kills Rukmi and breaks the teeth of the king of Kalinga. That's cool. Chapter 62 contains 33 verses. This chapter begins the discourse concerning the abduction of Usha, the daughter of Banasura, and the amorous pastimes between Usha and Aniruddha. So it's not that Usha was abducted, Aniruddha was abducted. She arranged by her mystic yogini friend Chitralekha to abduct Aniruddha. It also describes a fight between Aniruddha and Banasura, and how Banasura seized Aniruddha with a snake noose. Chapter 63, which contains 53 verses, describes how the strength of Lord Shiva was defeated in a battle between Banasura and the Yadavas. The Rudra Dwara, having been defeated by the Vaishnava Dwara, offered prayers to Krishna. Krishna severed all but 4 of Bana's 1,000 arms, and thus showed him mercy. Krishna then returned to Dwarka, with Usha and Aniruddha. Why couldn't Krishna kill Banas? Anyone know? What? A devotee of what? No. Because he was in the family of Prahlad Maharaj, and Krishna guaranteed that he would never kill anyone in Prahlad Maharaj's family again. That's why Krishna could not. I mean, Krishna could have, but that's why Krishna didn't kill Banasura and left him with 4 arms. Chapter 64 contains 44 verses. In this chapter, Krishna liberates King Riga, the son of Ikshvaku, from a curse, and instructs all kings by explaining the fault of misappropriating the property of a Brahmin, which he did by accident. You got to be careful in the karma kanja process. In connection with the deliverance of King Riga, there are instructions for the Yadavas who were puffed up with pride due to wealth, opulence, enjoyment, and so on. Chapter 65 contains 34 verses. As described in this chapter, Lord Baladev, desiring to see his friends and relatives, went to Gokula in the months of Chaitra and Vaishakha in the groves by the Yamuna. Lord Balaram performed the Rasa Rasotsava and Yamuna Karashana Leelas, that means dragging the Yamuna, in the association of his gopis. As described in chapter 66, which contains 43 verses, Krishna went to Kashi and then killed Pondraka, as well as his friend, the king of Kashi, Sudakshina, and others. Pondraka was an imitation of Krishna. Chapter 57, which contains 28 verses, describes how Lord Baladev, while enjoying with many young girls on Raivataka mountain, vanquished the extremely mischievous ape, Vidvida, who was the brother of Minda and a friend of Narakasuras. Vidvida was actually a devotee of Lord Ram, along with Minda, but he became contaminated by association with Narakasura. Chapter 58 has 54 verses, as described in this chapter, when Samba, the son of Jambavati, kidnapped Lakshmana, the daughter of Duryodhana. He was captured in a fight with the Kauravas. In order to free him and establish peace, Lord Balaram went to Hastinapur as a well-wisher. The Kauravas, however, were uncooperative, and upon seeing their arrogance, Lord Baladev began pulling their city in Hastinapur with his plow. The Kauravas, headed by Duryodhana, offered prayers to Lord Baladev, who then returned to Dwarka with Samba and Lakshmana. Chapter 69 contains 45 verses. As described in this chapter, Krishna exhibited his household life with his 16,000 wives. Actually, 16,108. Even the great sage Narada was astonished at how Krishna, having expanded himself into 16,000 forms, was conducting his household life. Thus Narada offered prayers to the Lord Krishna, and Krishna was very much pleased with him. Chapter 70, which contains 47 verses, describes how Krishna exhibited his daily ritualistic ceremonies and how he released the kings arrested by Jarasandha. While Lord Krishna was receiving a messenger sent by these kings, Narada came to see Krishna and told him news of the Pandavas. Narada informed Krishna that the Pandavas desired to perform a Rajasuya sacrifice, and Krishna agreed to attend it. But he first asked for Uddhava's decision about whether to give preference to killing King Jarasandha or performing the Rajasuya yajna. Chapter 71 contains 45 verses describing the happiness of the Pandavas when Krishna went to Indraprastha. By the inconceivable desire of Krishna, Jarasandha would be killed and the Rajasuya yajna would be performed by Maharaj Yudhisthira. Chapter 72 contains 46 verses. By agreeing to perform this Rajasuya yajna, Krishna gave Maharaj Yudhisthira great pleasure. This chapter also describes the killing of Jarasandha, the enthroning of his son, and the release of the kings whom Jarasandha had arrested. Chapter 73 contains 35 verses. After Lord Krishna released the kings and restored their royal power, he was worshipped by Sahadev, the son of Jarasandha, and then he returned to Indraprastha with Bhima and Arjuna. Chapter 74 contains 54 verses. Maharaj Yudhisthira offered prayers to Krishna, offered him the first worship in the Rajasuya yajna. To honor the Lord in this way is the foremost duty of every man. But this was intolerable to Shishupala, the king of Chedi. Shishupala began to blaspheme Krishna, who thus severed the king's head from his body and awarded him the salvation called Sarupya mukti. Of course, Shishupal was Krishna's cousin. He had gotten the benediction he could blaspheme Krishna up to 100 times before getting killed. After the conclusion of the Rajasuya sacrifice, Krishna returned to Dwarka with his queens. Chapter 75 contains 40 verses. As described in this chapter, Maharaj Yudhisthira, after the Rajasuya Yajna, performed the final ritualistic bathing ceremony. Duryodhana was bewildered in the palace constructed by Maya Danava, and thus he felt insulted. He fell down where there was water, but he thought it was land, and he thought the land was water, and he ran into the doorways, and Draupadi laughed at him the whole time. That really riled him up. Chapter 76 contains 33 verses describing how Shalva, one of the kings Krishna defeated when he kidnapped Rukmini, decided to rid the entire world of the Yadavas. To defeat the Yadavas, Shalva worshipped Lord Shiva, rewarded him with an aerial car named Solba. When Shalva fought with the Vrishnis, Pradyumna smashed the car designed by Mayadanava, but he was attacked by Shalva's brother, whose name was Duman. Beaten unconscious by Duman's club, Pradyumna was carried some distance away from the battlefield, from the war field, by his charioteer, but later he lamented having been removed from the battlefield. Chapter 77 contains 37 verses. In this chapter, Pradyumna recovers from his injuries and begins fighting with Shalva. When Krishna returned to Dwarka from Indraprastha, he immediately went to the battlefield where Shalva and Pradyumna were fighting. Thus he killed Shalva, although Shalva was powerfully equipped with illusory weapons. Exciting. Chapter 78 contains 40 verses. As described in this chapter, a friend of Shalva's named Danta Vakra and Danta Vakra's brother Viduratha were killed by Sri Krishna. Instead of taking part in the fighting between